Okay, I'm just going to analyse the game from 1934. Playing as white is Max Euwe, who 2 years later became the world chess champion by defeating Alexander Elyakhin. Playing black is Emanuel Lasker, who at this point in time was 66 years old. That's 2 years older than I am now, and it was 34 years. Sorry. 44 years after he had become world champion and 13 years after he had lost the world championship. And to produce such a high quality game against such a top player at an age of 66 is an incredible feat. An incredible feat. And another thing which makes the game very interesting is that both players try to sacrifice their queen for a rook, knight, and pawn. Now, a rook, knight, and pawn are together worth 5 for the rook, 3 for the knight, 1 for the pawn, 9 points. And queen is worth 9 points. So it's theoretical material equality. But in that trade, of course, the player who gives up the queen gets 3 units, and the player who keeps the queen gets only 1. And 2 extra units in the end game. So these things can often be crucial. I know that actually depends on the position, quality, and activity of the different units, but if all things are equal, if they're all pieces are in equally good positions or of equally well coordinated, then the player who has the most units, the most numbers of pieces, regardless of what the pieces are, has the better winning chances. I'm not saying they're going to win because of that, but both try to encourage their opponent to take their queen for that particular material imbalance or theoretical material equality. So let's see what happens. Max Euwe plays d4, d5, very common, even though very common then. Pawn c4, the queen's gambit, and Lasker declines with e6. Probably the safest way of declining the gambit at this point. Both develop a knight, and the knight is pinned to the queen to put more pressure on the d-pawn. So Lasker defends his knight. Wait a minute, I hear you say. Can't white win a pawn by playing pawn takes pawn? Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and the knight's pinned. No, white cannot win a pawn that way, because black just goes ahead and takes the pawn. And when black takes the queen, white takes the queen, black comes to b4 with the bishop and says check, and the only alternative is to put the queen in the way. The queen gets taken, and the king takes the bishop, and white has an extra piece. Don't be falling for this trap. But it's Max Euwe we were talking about. He's not falling for that trap. Pawn to e3 gives the king another square, so that all of that plan doesn't work and allows the bishop to come out eventually. So black supports the d5 pawn with the pawn on c6 and creates a typical semi-Slav structure. The knight's developed, and now black has the choice of playing my favourite, queen to a5, the Cambridge Springs defence. But by the time 1934 had come round, 7 years after the match between Elyakhin and Capablanca, the Cambridge Springs defence, which was played by both sides a lot in that match, had become less popular. People have found out ways to combat the Cambridge Springs defence, and it's never been as popular at the top level since. It doesn't stop me playing it. Yeah, so instead he plays bishop to e7 to support the knight and to allow the knight to move to. So if the pawn's taken, he can take with the knight first, offer a swap, and then see what happens from there. So the queen develops and black castles. Black is trying to encourage white to play the bishop first, then he can take the pawn, and white takes back with the bishop, and in that way has used 2 moves to get his bishop to there, where he could have done it in 1. So a3 is a very good quality waiting move. Rook e1, rook e8 is a good quality waiting move, and rook c1 is a good way to wait with developing the bishop. But Lasker says, okay, you're not going to go for that. I've had enough time. I've wasted enough time waiting for you to play that. I'm just going to take the pawn anyway. And Euwe takes the pawn on c4. The knight comes to d5. So the bishop is threatened. So he's threatened to play bishop takes, and if the knight takes, he takes back with the queen. If Euwe takes the bishop, then the knight comes back and takes the bishop. So, or can. But that's not what happens. The queen takes, and he's willing to play a knight to b6, threaten the bishop, and that way white again has used 2 moves to get his bishop to a place where it could have gotten with 1 move. So knight comes into a better, more central position, and the knight goes back, drops the idea of threatening the bishop. So white, once he moves his knight out of the way, is now ready to castle, and black isn't ready to castle, so black will have to move the knight and then the bishop before he is finished with development. As soon as white castled, he's finished with development. So white has a little developmental advantage here, but there is maneuvering which will take place. So black goes to work against white's central structure, and he castles. Now it might have been possible there to play pawn takes pawn, and then when knight takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and we're about level. We've got 4 pawns each, 2 each on the queen side, 4 each on the king side, and the same 2 knights. So yeah, maybe not any advantage for that, but once he's castled, there might be an advantage from that. So black takes on d4, and the knight comes to a better central position, and the knight comes to b6 to attack the bishop. The bishop retreats to a2, looking at the b1 square, looking at the h7 square with mating threats. So you can imagine a scenario where white develops his bishop, white plays here, white brings his rook into the game, and black brings his rook into the game, white plays here, and then he's got the chance of playing pawn here, chasing the knights away, and he's threatening mate in the corner. But Euwe doesn't do anything about that. He plays rook to b8. Why? Because if he just develops his bishop and completes development, then the queen comes to c7, threatens the pawn on b7, and begins the job of doubling up the queen and rook. If he plays c7 now, well, the queen just takes, and the bishop can come out, and it's just a queen swap. There isn't any advantage for white in that idea, so he doesn't go for it. So now he's got his plan of playing bishop to b1, e5, and that would win him a piece. Lasker ignores this and attacks the rook, the knight. The knight's defended by the rook. The bishop comes out now. Which is the best order to do it in? Play the pawn first, and then the bishop, or play the bishop first and then the pawn? Euwe decides it's better to play the pawn first. If Lasker decides that, it's better to play the pawn first. So the knight comes to e8, knight on e8, there is no mate. People also say knight on f8, there is no mate. Good defensive square. And now the bishop comes to b1, creating a battery against the h7 square. And the pawn comes to g6, opening up the possibility for white to fianchetto the knight and then possibly come to the f5 square with his knight and then do some swapping off on that square. Opens up the possibility anyway. So the queen comes to d4, e4 even. Yeah, a more centralized position. Now, black could attack the queen immediately and swap off. But he plays a little finesse first. He attacks the rook, so that if the rook moves, well, then this knight isn't looking particularly good. And yeah. And so this provokes the move b3, which leaves the a3 pawn hanging. Of course, you can't take it, just take the a3 pawn now, because then he loses the bishop. But he doesn't come to c6. He comes back to d7. And now the pawn moves out of the way of the attack, leaving this hole on b4. The knight comes to d5, maybe looking at preventing a knight from coming to f6. So the bishop comes to d3. He might be looking at playing bishop to b5 and taking with the knight and bringing a knight into this square, which if he then takes, he can then play bishop takes pawn, and he's got pawn takes knight, and he's got a very far advanced deep free pawn. So yeah. So Lasker proposes a swap of rooks, but Euwe denies him that chance. And they both put pressure on the d5 square with their bishops, and the knight takes the bishop, leaving white with the only light squared bishop. The pawn takes. You could argue that this pawn is weak since it's isolated and backwards, but it gives a fantastic grip on this d5 square. So the rook comes into action. Maybe it's looking to come over to f6, f3. So knight comes to b4, threatening the rook in two ways, with the rook on d8 and with the knight. And he plays rook to f3. Right, so Lasker prepares to double his rooks on the d file. And two purposes for the h4 move. One is to make an escape square for his king, so that rook to d7, rook to e1 d1 is no longer a mating threat, and also to put pressure on the kingside structure with h5. The rooks are doubled anyway, and the pawn is attacked. Queen comes to g5. He's threatening the pawn with the bishop, with the queen and the pawn. It's defended just by the knight at the minute. But he also threatens this pawn, which is now defended by the rook and queen. The rook comes to d4 to attack the queen. So here comes the first dramatic moment in the game. You might expect the best response is just to retreat with the rook, with the queen. But that gives up this square and this square to the black rook, which is probably a bit too much. So Euwe takes the pawn on g6. What happens if Lasker takes the queen? Then pawn takes pawn first, threatening the knight and saying check. The king moves, a new queen arrives on f7, e7, e8 even. It gets taken, and then this queen gets taken. So, yeah, it's not going to work out well for black. It's going to be theoretical material equality, but black is going to be under severe attack and with many less units in the endgame. So he declines that queen. And he takes the pawn, and now that there is no longer the threat to play pawn to f7 check, then black has no choice but to retreat his queen. So there was no swap of queen for rook, knight, and bishop. Rook, knight, and pawn in that case. So the queen gets threatened again and has to come to the very sad square of f1. The rook comes to c2 and threatens the rook on e1. And now it's a threat on the knight for Euwe against Lasker. On the queen, sorry. So he takes the pawn on e5, but wait a minute, doesn't that give a discovered attack to black? To white it does indeed. White plays knight to f6, check, threatening the queen with the rook. But Lasker says, yes, I'll take that, I'll take that, I'll give my queen for that rook and knight, and the pawn. And now white has no choice but to accept it. So we now see that white, they've both got a rook and a minor piece, and white has a queen, and black has another minor piece, a rook, and 5 pawns against 4. So he's got that situation we talked about of theoretical material equality. Rook, knight, and pawn worth 9 points, the same as a queen. But whose position do you like best? I know I certainly like Lasker's position best. So the rook comes to c2. It's not really threatening to take the knight, because if he takes the knight, then black can play rook to d1 and pin the queen to the king. So the knight isn't threatened by the rook in this circumstance. So the knight threatens the pawn on f2. Black is now threatened to play rook takes f2, which will be embarrassing for the queen, because the queen won't have anywhere to go. Can't go to e1 covered by the rook. The knight can't go to e2 covered by d1 covered by the rook, and the whole of the second line is covered by the rook, and d3 is covered by the rook. So a serious threat to take on e4. And so white puts the bishop in the way to defend the f2 pawn. And now black attacks the rook, the knight, bishop even, on e2. So the bishop comes out of the way, but this allows knight takes pawn. Can't take back with the queen, because then he takes with the rook takes the king takes the rook, knight takes the bishop, and whichever he takes the knight back, the knight with king or pawn, he's left with 3 pawns against 5 pawns in a rook only endgame. Great position for black. So he can't afford to take that knight. So he withdraws the queen, attacks the knight, attacks the c6 pawn. The knight comes to d3 to attack the bishop, which it's defended by the queen. To attack the rook, sorry, on c1. It's obviously defended by the queen. So he has to move the rook, and he moves it to f1. And now he defends the knight for a second time and puts 2 attackers on the bishop on c3. Knight to e5. And Euwe attacks the rook, which temporarily is not defended by the other rook because the knight stands in the way. You might think then that the best plan is to play knight takes pawn and then defend the rook. But that's not what happens. He plays the other knight, takes the pawn and defends the rook with the pawn, not with the rook. So obviously if he takes with the rook, Lasker is going to play knight takes pawn check, pawn takes knight, and he's got 2 rooks for his queen and a much better position. So the pawn's taken, but he doesn't do the plan I just mentioned. He plays instead rook to knight to e2 check. It's like if the king comes here, if the king comes to h1, sorry, then the knight comes to g3, forking king and rook, and we're in the same position as before. So he comes to h2. Then that allows a discovered check on f4, and the king goes to e2, h1 even. Not many squares left for the king, and the rook attacks the queen, and at the same time defends the knight on f4. The queen comes out of the way of the attack of the rook and attacks the rook again, so that the rook is pinned to the defense of the other rook. King comes to g7, 2 effect. It opens up the 8th rank, particularly a square h8, and it makes the king safe from perpetual check threats. So the queen comes to c7, and the rook comes to g5. D5, threatening to come to either g5 or h5. The rook comes to d1, and if the knight moves, then the pawn can be taken on e6 since the f6 pawn is pinned. But that's not going to happen. So he plays rook to g6, g5 even, so that the king is cut off and any check on the h-file will be made. Black takes a pawn, and white makes that check on the h-file possible, and black resigns. There's nothing he can do to prevent rook to h8, checkmate. A wonderful game. Both wanted the opponent to take their queen. Eventually, white took the queen and paid the penalty for it, but I'll just reiterate again. Emanuel Lasker was 2 years older than I am now when he played this game, 40 years after he had become world champion. He beat the player who, just 2 years later, became the world champion. A fantastic achievement by the old man Lasker. Okay, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment on this video. Yeah, thanks. Bye.